Bastich B here for 64K, and welcome to my latest documentary. This one is called And welcome back. So on today's episode, as you've already seen, I'll be having a look at all 6 installments of the Ultima RPG franchise on the Commodore 64, as well as a little bit of the history of the making of the games. And if you're unfamiliar with this series, then fear not, here's a little crash course in Ultima lore. The RPG genre of games have always fascinated me, right from the start. The countless grand adventures I went on with all my Commodore 64 role-playing games by companies such as SSR, Westwood, Electronic Arts, Interplay, Epix, and of course Origin Systems. These games were all well above and beyond what I imagined computer games could be, and I soaked up every one of them I could find. And even though my introduction to the Ultima franchise would only begin with Exodus Ultima 3 on the C64 in 1984, the story of the franchise goes way back before that to 1979, when a young Richard Garriott published his first video game, A Calibeth World of Doom, on the Apple II computer. It's considered amongst one of the first slew of RPGs released on computer game form, and a sort of precursor to the Ultima franchise. Richard's inspiration for making the game came after his introduction to Dungeons & Dragons, which he started playing during high school, and his alter ego, Lord British, who Richard goes under in his programming credits, and of course is the king of Caesarea and eventually Britannia in the actual game series, came from friends calling him British due to his dual citizenship, as he was born in the UK but grew up in America.
There was a 7-week class for high school students in computer programming and mathematics, like statistics and a few other things. And when I arrived at this dorm, which was with about 50 other kids, co-ed, terrible idea to send your junior high children to a co-ed 7-week summer program, by the way, parents. But I had a good time. But when I arrived, the other kids that were there ahead of me had already discovered this game, Dungeons & Dragons, and they were going door to door as people arrived and giving them each a name. And when they came to my door, they said hi, and I said hello, and they said, hello, nobody from around here says hello. You must be from Britain, so we'll call you British. And I went, well, interestingly, I actually was born in England, so I am a British citizen, even though I clearly do not have a British accent, since I only lived there for like 3 months as a baby.
British therefore became his name of his first D&D character. A Calibeth was published after Richard showed the game to his boss at a computer store he worked at called Computerland. His boss was so impressed that he said he'd sell it in the store. The
owner of that store, a guy named John Mayer, who saw me playing with this game in the back room, between shifts, and said, Richard, that game is way better than anything we have for sale on the pegboards here at the store. He said, we're telling people to spend $2,000 or $3,000 in that machine to do things like balance their checkbook or keep a recipe card file. And this thing you've done is way better than that. You should publish it. A copy eventually found its way to a company called California Pacific Computer Company, and they agreed to give the game a full published rollout in 1980, and thus the origins of the Ultima franchise started. The first 3 games in the series are referred to as the Age of Darkness. They were published by 3 different companies. The first, California Pacific, the second, Revenge of the Enchantress by Sierra Online, and the third, Exodus by Origin Systems, which Richard formed to be in control of his own franchise once and for all. The second series started in 1985, called The Age of Enlightenment, and included Quest of the Avatar, Warriors of Destiny, and The False Prophet. All 6 of these games found their way onto the Commodore 64 from 1984 to 1990, even though the series was released out of order initially on the C64 due to the computer not existing in 1981 when the original Ultima was published. We'll be looking at all these games in a lot more detail later. The series did continue on with the PC taking up the mantle, and we saw the Age of the Armageddon series continue with Black Gate, Serpent Isle,
Pagan, and finally Ascension in 1999, which saw the end of the mainline series. Between 1983 and roughly 1993, we also got to see a bunch of fantastic spin-off games as well, including the dungeon-bashing goodness of the Ultima Underworld series, the Worlds of Ultima, which also included Savage Empire and Martian Dreams, and the extremely obscure Ultima Escape from Mount Drash, released on the VIC-20 in 1983 by Sierra Online, being the rarest and most expensive game to acquire. The series was also extremely popular in Japan, where it got its first translated version with the release of Ultima 3 Exodus. It's said to have been hugely influential on the Japanese RPG scene and helped mold the entire genre, with Japan getting their own unique versions on both consoles like the Famicom, MSX, and even the Super Famicom, but also exclusive versions to Japanese computers like the FM Towns and Sharp X68000. The last official Ultima game though was Ultima Online, started in 1997 and is still ongoing to this day, which you can now play for free.
And now that you know a little bit about the history, let's start checking out some of the C64 versions.
Originally released in 1981 on the Apple II computer was Ultima, published by California Pacific Computer Company, the first in a long line of classic RPGs by Richard Garriott. Although it's his second game release, it's considered his first professional game, as Akalabeth was never originally made for commercial release. With the success of Akalabeth, I decided to start fresh with my first work intended for public consumption. I began a game originally entitled Ultimatum, built on much of the same codebase as Akalabeth. It continued to refine the Richard Garriott virtual world building techniques. The game maps were largely based on D&D worlds I created called Caesarea. When finished, we launched it under the name Ultima. The game was programmed by Garriott himself and Ken Arnold, a fellow Computerland employee that Richard befriended. They were coding the game while both attending the University of Texas. That's where a good friend of mine, Ken Arnold, comes in. Ken was another employee there at Computerland. He was really the person I must credit with the invention of what I now call tile graphics, which have been emulated and copied throughout the world really at this point in other products. Ultima builds on everything that Akalabeth set up, but takes it to a whole nother level. Besides the dungeon sequences, it's really a whole new game unto itself. The story takes place in the land of Caesarea, which is split up into 4 massive continents to explore, as seen in these fantastic maps that come with the game. Your ultimate quest is to stop an immortal wizard, Mondane, who has invaded the land. You need to collect through various quests 4 gems, which can be used to power a time machine and travel back in time and kill Mondane before he becomes immortal. Oh, and you get to travel to space and save a princess, because why not? It's really quite an imaginative adventure, far beyond storytelling that were in games at this time. This game also marks the appearance of Lord British, the ruler of Caesarea and later Britannia, which was Richard's alter ego in video game form. And here's him explaining how the character came about.
When California Pacific saw this, like, what is this with Richard Garriott, Lord British, Chamino, explain all this to us. And I told them that, well, they're all sort of these different manifestations of me, and explained why. They went, well, if we market this as Richard Garriott, it's a name like anybody else. There's nothing wrong with that name. But people weren't using nom de plumes yet. And they said, if we use Lord British, it makes some rational sense because you were born there. It's a character in the game. They just liked the whole moniker of it. And so they said, let's erase all those other useless names, and let's let Lord British be the primary author and creator.
Your character is simply known as the Stranger, but in later games he'll become known as the Avatar, which most people know him by. Obviously the game takes a lot of inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons, just like most RPGs of this era, but has a ton of innovations that push the genre forward dramatically. You can create your own character, just like a tabletop game. You have an overworld map which you can walk around freely. There are first-person dungeon sequences which you can explore and loot. You can enter towns and castles where the view changes yet again to gather information about quests, buy and sell items, weapons, buy food, heal yourself, etc, etc. Almost everything a modern RPG can do, but only in 1981 style. The game was truly a blueprint on how to take classic fantasy board game tropes and bring them to life in a whole new way in computer form. As mentioned earlier, the C64 version of this installment was only released in 1986 as part of Origin Systems redoing and updating the first classic trilogy, which they now dubbed the Age of Darkness series, for modern computers of that era, due to fans demanding them, as most people never got to play the originals due to them being released on the Apple II initially. The C64 version fares up really well, and Origin also took the time to update the games as well to fit into what modern SSI and other RPG developers' games looked like during this period. The tile-based graphics are vastly improved, giving everything a nice, simple, clean look. The speed of the gameplay is also way faster, and the sound is improved dramatically. It's actually a really easy game to get into as well. Just make sure you have a reference card or a PDF online to check out the keyboard commands, which are all quite logical, and you'll be adventuring in no time. I also like the nice new little intro sequences that was also added to these versions. This wasn't the first C64 Ultima game that I ever played, that was Exodus, but this truly is a wonderful open world to explore with simple to understand gameplay, but also enough depth and detail to immerse you in its world. And the C64 update is one of the best versions of this game available, and a must play for any Commodore 64 RPG fan. The game's conversion was done by David Shapiro, who goes under the name Dr. Cat, and he also appears as a character in the games under that name in multiple later installments in the series. The original version would end up selling 30,000 copies for California Pacific, with the magazine Computer Gaming World in its January 1982 issue say Ultima is one of the best computer fantasy role-playing games to date, and ended up making Richard instantly decide to pursue game development as his future career path. Ultima 2 The Revenge of the Enchantress was originally released in 1982, roughly a year and a half after the series' debut. Richard knew he could improve the game in many ways and upped his programming skills by learning assembly language, which in turn made the game look and grow in size exponentially. This was also the first Ultima game to get ports made to many other systems of the time, as opposed to the original, which only saw a wide release in 1986 with the Trilogy Collection. Richard was a big fan of the 1981 Terry Gilliam movie Time Bandits, which he watched in the cinema many times, and that movie would serve as an inspiration in multiple ways on Ultima 2, from the time-traveling plot to the warp gates and the map itself the dwarves use in the movie.
But then with Ultima 2, I really wanted to do time travel. And so Ultima 2 sort of takes place on Earth. And the reason why I chose Earth is that if you're going to go back in time, it's important to have some references as to what does it mean to be backwards in time. So if you go far enough back, you get to the time of dinosaurs. If you go, and the continents might be shaped like Pangea. And and if you go to medieval times, everybody has a reference for that. If you go to the future, we have our Star Wars, Star Trek references for that. So I needed it to be Earth-like, just to have this reference for going backwards and forwards in time, which was sort of how, the Ultima 1 ended, was with this time travel, so I was kind of embracing that.
The plot for the game involves Mondane's evil apprentice, Minax, who sends her minions back in time to various places in Earth's history to disrupt the timeline and cause war amongst nations, thus erasing humanity and the stranger from history. You are called upon again by Lord British to take advantage of the cracks in time caused by Mondane and travel back to stop Minax and her hordes. You get to travel to, amongst other, 300 BC, 1423, 1990, 2112, and various planets in the solar system. Richard also wanted to provide books of lore about the backstory and a map, and a proper box this time for the game, as most up until that point were still being published in bags.
Compared to most games of, especially back in this day, which were coin-op arcade knockoffs, I was already creating virtual worlds that I wanted people to feel were real. And so Ultima 2 was actually the first game in our industry that came in a box. And not only was it in a box, but it had things to imply that the world was real. It had cloth maps, and the cloth maps, had arcane information on them about how to travel around the world through these mystical gateways and portals. It included instruction manuals that, to the best degree they could, wouldn't confess that this was a computer game. To the best you could, it would try to describe the world as if it was a real place that we could explore and conquer together.
Many companies turned down publishing the game due to the cost involved with the trinkets, but finally Sierra Online stepped up and decided to publish it. The game was much larger than the original, with much bigger towns and cities as well. more vehicles for travel including planes, boats, and spaceships, and the first-person dungeon levels were back. It's still a single-party experience with successful battles resulting in leveling up and collecting items. The C64 version was first released in 1984 and is a direct port to the Apple II version with no enhancements, which honestly makes it feel a little bit dated and clunky even in 1984. The one major change though was changing the tile colors to really bright whites and greens, making the look of the game look quite different than the rest of the series on the C64. I feel the black tile system looks much better and keeps the continuity, but as far as the game goes on the C64, this was by far my least favorite of the series. It's bigger and tries to be more grand, but when it comes down to it, its gameplay is simply a big grind fest reminding me of some sort of dodgy pay-to-win JRPG. It's also very hard to get into and you'll die countlessly in the beginning with no idea what you're doing. The game does get much better though with time, of course, and it is pretty epic in nature with the story, but due to Ultima 1 being remade in 1986 on the C64 and refined, makes this one look a little bit dated in comparison. Fortunately, there's also a version on the C64 known as Ultima 2 Black, which is the demo scene community altering the weird color scheme of this release and gives the game the black tile scheme to fit in with the rest of the series, which is great if you don't like the look of this game. Bear in mind, I've never played any other version of this game, and this opinion is simply based on the C64 version, which I'd honestly recommend you skip, as it might put you off the rest of the wonderful series. The original version of this sequel was even more successful than the original game and sold over 50,000 copies by 1985 and over 100,000 by 1990. And now on to Ultima 3 Exodus, released in 1983 by Origin Systems, and the last of the Age of Darkness trilogy. Due to a dispute about royalties with Sierra, Ultima 3 became the first published game by Richard himself independently, as the formation of his own company began, called Origin Systems, a company that would go on to massive success and fame, with great games like Times of Law, Wing Commander, Crusader No Remorse, and tons of other great games I played back in the day, as well as starting the careers of programmers and designers such as Chris Roberts and Warren Spector. Brand new code was written for the game, and the future of Richard and Origin themselves hung in the balance, as the game needed to succeed for both to continue in the industry. So no pressure. The story this time involves Mundane and Minax's demon spawn kid who has grown up now and wants revenge on Cesaria and the Stranger, and thus releases his minions across the land to rain on the destruction. The C64 version was released 1 year after in 1984, the same year as Ultima 2 on the Commodore. The game itself brought a host of new improvements to the series and RPGs in general. It was no longer a single character game, as you could make up a party of up to 4 people, and the combat system was way more intricate. When monsters are encountered on the overworld map, it flips to a separate turn-based screen for the battles to commence. It wasn't the first game to do this, but due to the series' high profile at this point, it was definitely one of the ones that popularized it for all RPGs going forward. Again, the maps were bigger and more detailed, with NPC conversations now having branching paths, giving everything more layers of lore and immersing you in the quest even further. The introduction of the moon gates were also here, and would be seen in all the games going forward, which were basically fast travel warps to get you around the map quicker. The conversion to the C64 is actually really good, and the game plays quite well, despite lots of loading. It's leaps and bounds better than Ultima 2, at least in my opinion. It also brings back the focus on a more precise story and much better combat that requires way more strategy as opposed to 2's hack and slash approach. The music by Ken Arnold is also very memorable, and he'd end up doing the C64 music on 4, 5, and 6, even though 6 is just the same as 5.
All Ultima music in these early days was composed by the same gentleman by the name Ken Arnold, who's a dear personal friend. I still think of all that music incredibly fondly. I have it on playlists I still periodically play here at my house.
The conversion to the Commodore was done by Chuck Buich, and he was also one of Richard's friends from university and a founder of Origin. And he went on to convert, design, and program tons of Origin games, such as Auto Duel and Omega, amongst many more. He's also a character in the games as Chuckles, Lord British's crazy Colchester. And although this game on the system runs really well, a C64 demo scene, a major help of the group Genesis Project, did a really nice update of this in 2007, which is where I captured all this footage from. Improvements such as a built-in fast loader, the game now compressed onto one floppy, so there's no disk swapping, lots of small gameplay tweaks, and a trainer menu if you're just plain terrible at RPGs. Ultima 3 Gold, as it's known, is available on CSDB.DK if you want to try it out. The game would also get a conversion to the Famicom a few years later, and became for most console gamers their first introduction to full-on RPG mechanics. Released just after Dragon Quest in 1986 in Japan, these two games are considered some of the most influential games on the JRPG scene in the early days, and an NES port followed in 1989. This for me was my introduction to the series, having played it at my next door neighbor's house and friend Clayton sometime in 1984, and kicked off a tradition of us playing these big grand RPGs together, which included Ultimas 4, 5 and 6, as well as The Legend of Black Silver, Space Rogue, Serpent Isle on the PC, and ended at my house in the 90s with us playing and completing Phantasy Star 2 on my Mega Drive. It was a memorable run. The game fortunately was a massive runaway success and secured Richard and Origin's future for many years to come, with Softline magazine saying, "Exodus Ultima 3 with a superior plot to match its superior gaming system is a great game. It upgrades the market in several ways. It sets new standards in fantasy gaming." And now on to Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar, released on the Commodore 64 in 1985, and the beginning of what is known as the Age of Enlightenment trilogy. Richard decided on a radical new direction for the series after reading a lot of fan mail about Ultima 3. Once I published Ultima 3, suddenly a large number of people wrote to the company, and I began to see exactly what people thought of the game. They would often describe how they would play the game. As I quickly realized, people were playing completely differently than I thought. They were mini-maxing for power versus role-playing as the hero. It was really eye-opening, and this sparked a fundamental change in the RPG direction. The game took 2 years to develop because of the new direction, with Richard this time upping the ante on story and character, and a bit less focus on the hack and slashing. The world is said to be roughly 16 times larger than Ultima 3 in scope, and is also the first in the series coded with the C64 in mind, and not just a port of the Apple II version. This one again was done by Chuckles. The story continues after Ultima 3, with Lord British trying to reunite the faith of the people of Sosaria after 3 cataclysmic events that warped their world almost beyond repair. He calls on the stranger once again to help rebuild the land, which he now dubs Britannia, and would be the world's name in all future games. There is no big bad to kill this time, but you have to, through your actions, reinstill people's faith in life by performing virtuous actions, which are now like little quests. The 8 virtues which you have to build up are honesty, compassion, valor, justice, sacrifice, honor, spirituality, and humanity. All of these have to be built up, and eventually you'll be able to enter the Stygian Abyss, which would get its own excellent spin-off game in the early 90s, and find the Codex of Ultimate Wisdom and thus become the Avatar.
Ultima 4 was particularly special in that it was the first time I could sit down and go, you know what, coding it is no longer the problem. Whatever the language is that we end up using, I'll figure it out. I now need to actually make a good game. Wait, no, what am I trying to do with games? What am I trying to say? What am I trying to prove? It is obvious it's going to go on for a while. I mean, Ultima 1, 2, and 3 only connect to each other because I looked backwards and said, well, I guess I got to pick up wherever it is I randomly left off, and let's continue. You know, Ultima 4 is when I finally said, okay, look, you know, I'm gonna get rid of the Balrogs from Tolkien. I'm going to get rid of the orcs also from Tolkien. I'm going to get rid of the lightsabers and land speeders from Star Wars. I'm going to make my own world. I'm going to make my own game from scratch and my own world from scratch. And I thought a lot about, the fact that people weren't being good guys in my game. I knew I wanted to make a game that had these ethical parables in it. But if you're doing a game with ethical parables, I said, look, it's important you're playing yourself, not an alter ego. Because if you're playing your, in D&D, a D&D campaign, you can play an evil wizard. And if you're playing an evil wizard, or if you're being Conan the Barbarian, you should be expected to act like an evil wizard or expected to act like a moral Conan. And so if I'm going to do a game about ethical parables, it's important that you feel guilty if you do something bad.
None of this means that there's no action, of course. You still get to crack a whole bunch of skulls in turn-based combat and quest it up, but the way you interact with people and situations affects your stats. If you be bad, for example, they will drop. The eyes of Lord British are always watching. The more people respect you, the more info you can get out of them, therefore expanding your game. It's also almost completely open world, meaning you can just go anywhere you want straight from the start, which is pretty impressive. The way you create your character is also pretty unique, involving visiting a gypsy where she asks you a bunch of moral questions, which there are no real right or wrong answers to, but forms the basis for your character and will be used in all future games in the series. The point is not whether you have strong enough muscles or big enough guns to win. The issue should be, what have you learned? What wisdom have you gained from beginning through to the end that really means you're now the appropriate person to solve the problem? The C64 version you've been seeing here is called Ultima 4 Remastered and is another brilliantly enhanced version of the C64 original, done again by major developer of Genesis project. And it's totally wonderful and fixes a bunch of small little bugs, offers full joystick support, and has a brilliant new intro sequence, reportedly ported from the Japanese FM Towns version. Plus the game is compressed, so no more disc swapping, and the loading speed is enhanced dramatically. It's the ultimate way to play this game on your C64, and I'd highly recommend picking it up as well. Europe was also fortunate enough to get this extremely rare C64 release by US Gold, with a wonderful alternate cover and overflowing with great lore and trinkets. And I just want to thank Neil over at RMC The Cave for shooting the special footage for us. This is just an absolutely brilliant RPG. It plays like nothing else at the time, or ever really, and proves that games can be more than just the sum of their parts by adding thought, depth, and obviously a whole lot of turn-based skull cracking. It also ended up getting a radically altered port in 1990 to the NES, as well as a Sega Master System version, which is the one and only time the Ultima series has appeared on a Sega machine. The game yet again was another huge success for Origin, with it already selling over 100,000 copies by 1986, only 1 year after its release. Ultima 5 Warriors of Destiny is the second Age of Enlightenment game and was released in 1988 on the Apple II and was the last game in the series to be programmed on that system, as by now Richard felt the machine at this point had reached its max. It's also the last to be programmed with Richard as the lead, as by this point the games had become way too big for one person to handle, and all future games would have the PC as the lead, and Richard would go on to the design and writer mode. The C64 version was done by Dr. Cat, and besides the crazy amount of loading and disc swapping, it's another bona fide classic. The story is just as intriguing and full of morality and so many grey areas of, is what I'm doing right? Questioning your choices in a game wasn't generally something you did. It was usually, there's the bad guy, let's kill him. The story this time kicks off with Lord British going missing after going on an expedition into the underworld, which now spans the entire length of Britannia to explore. In his place, a tyrant, Lord Blackthorn, is now ruling. He's enforcing British's virtue laws by any means necessary, which begs the question, is his actions virtuous? Is he helping or enslaving Britannia? That's the moral grey area you exist in. Ultimately, you have to reinstate Lord British and solve the mystery of the Shadow Lords that have invaded the land. Where Ultima 4 was fairly black and white, I mean good guys are good guys and bad guys are bad guys, Ultima 5 unfolds in a grey area. Lots of characters try to convince you that Blackthorn is doing things just right. Some say he's an evil force, and others realize he's wrong but are taking advantage of the situation for personal profit, and are willing to fight anyone who opposes Blackthorn. This on the C64 was another one I poured hours over, just wandering around and exploring and solving problems that, like I said earlier, was anything but black and white. And here's Richard on one of the most amusing and moral choices you have to make in the game.
We were getting ready to publish Ultima 5. We were literally days away from what was referred to as the Gold Master, the version that would be copied on the machines. And one of our employees wrote a letter to my brother that he read, and then came storming into my office, all up in arms, and was like, Richard, what did you do with Ultima 5? What did you do in this game that is creating this reaction? And I'm going like, what reaction? What are you talking about? And he says, and the letter basically says, I refuse to work for a company that so clearly supports child abuse. And Robert's going like, what in the world did you put in this game that has created this reaction? And I'm going like, I actually have no idea. I can't even imagine what this person could be talking about. So we go to this employee and we're going like, wow, what has set you off in this incredibly extreme way? And he describes that what it is is it's one of the dungeon rooms near the very end of the game, literally the final push to the very end. There is a little dungeon room, and it has cages in the corners, and the cages are full of children, and there's a lever in the middle of the room, and if you switch the lever, the cages are removed, and the children are actually monsters, but they're all the way around you. Purposely, I put them all the way around on purpose, and they swarm and attack you. And I had put them in there going, it's in the final push, you can't do anything unvirtuous or you'll have to start that section over. And so I knew the player would not want to kill the children for fear of losing their moral standing. And so I thought, what a fun little test. It actually wasn't a test. They're monsters. You actually could kill them. But I just thought, this will be a funny trick for a mental quandary for the player. And put it in. But this person clearly thought somehow I was encouraging you to harm children. And so they were somehow incensed. And my brother's going like, Richard, you have to take this out of the game because this would, if this happens in the general public, we'll be crucified as a company. And I was like, no, you don't get it. This guy's wrong. Not only is he wrong in the sense of don't throw the lever, just walk out of the room, charm the children and they'll walk away, put them to sleep and you can walk past them. Drop your sword and punch them in the face, they'll be hurt and they'll run away. Or, by the way, they're monsters that happen to look like children. If little vampire children are coming and biting at your heels, kill them.
The game itself obviously grew in size and is even bigger than the last, with more towns, NPCs, and way more intricate dialogue. But my favorite part was how interactive all the objects were now. Searching, looking, and using, almost all of the trinkets and objects had some sort of planned result, even if it was just simple as playing a harp for no real reason. This one made the world seem a lot more believable. It wasn't the first to do this, have a day-night cycle, but it did it in a way where the NPCs actually had lives. They go about their business, wake up in the morning, go to work, come home and sleep. If you arrived in a town at midnight, the results would be a ghost town. It's these simple additions that took the series to a whole new level. The world is just teeming with activity, with horses, ships, and even magic carpets to ride. And of course the moon gates for fast travel and the entire below-ground underworld to explore. It was massive. The original C64 version had no music, as the entire memory was taken up, but if you had a Commodore 128, it was available for you. And Ken Arnold provides his best soundtrack, for me anyway, of all the 8-bit versions. Fortunately, like a bunch of the C64 version we already looked at, it also happens to have a remastered version. It's definitely not as elaborate as the excellent 4's version, but addresses some big issues. The music is now reinstated in the C64 version, which is fantastic, and the game is compressed into a CRT file, making disk swapping a thing of the past, as well as speeding up the loading dramatically. So in that sense, it's the best version yet again to try out on your Commodore 64, and I would highly recommend it. This was also the last game to use the classic tile Apple II look, as the next game was built from the ground up to max modern computers of the time. And now on to the final C64 Ultima game, Ultima 6, The False Prophet, released originally in 1990 on DOS, 2 years after Warriors. The game went for a whole new look and feel. No overworld maps, just a close-up of you and your party, with wonderful detailed graphics to boot. The fact that this game even came out on the C64 is pretty amazing. The PC version is much better, of course, but that didn't matter to me in 1991 when I originally loaded this up and the C64 version was released. It just sucked me into Britannia's world, even more so than the rest. The story this time seems a lot simpler on the surface, as we see Britannia invaded by a bunch of gargoyles. The Avatar is summoned in one of the coolest intros in RPG history, but the kicker is the only reason the gargoyles attacked is cause their land was invaded and ruined by the actions of the Avatar and Lord British in the previous games. Unintentionally, of course. Thus sets up the moral grey area that is the final game in the Age of Enlightenment trilogy. My guess why this got ported probably was Origin reasoning. Even though the C64 was waning at this point in the US, it still had an insane installer base worldwide, so the task was set to convert it. And here's Richard talking a little bit about the making of the Ultima 6 engine.
By the time we get to Ultima 6, it's about 2 years to make an engine, to make a game. And 2 years is a long time, and it's a lot of money. The cost going into Ultima 6 was, by today's standards, just negligible, but it was probably, $1 million or $2 million that would go into the construction of that game over 2 years. And that 2-year time frame is a long time to wait between products, and it's a big investment that may or may not pay off. And And so the company is beginning to feel, all companies are beginning to feel this pain associated with rebuilding engines from scratch every time is a pretty expensive habit to keep up.
And for the most part, only a few things were left on the cutting room floor. The major stuff is some dialogue was trimmed, the close-up portrait shots of the characters are gone, and there is no horse transport, but you honestly don't miss any of it once you start playing. Battles again are turn-based party affairs, and the world improves on the day-night living cycle, and ups the ante on interactivity with objects and people. This was probably the last RPG I played on the old bread box originally, and one of the final ones Clayton and I played together. We had a bootleg version, of course, because C64 original games at that point were really hard to find. So we set out the task of mapping the entire game first before we actually started playing it, which took months. Fortunately, we did have help, as we had a basic idea what Britannia looked like, thanks to it not deviating too much from 4 and 5. After that, we played and played and played. From Underworld to Surface, it was epic. It was a game that took up a better part of a year to play, and despite it loading every few seconds, making 50% of that playtime actual loading time, I loved every minute of it. The icons at the bottom of the screen in the DOS version are replaced with simple joystick and a few keyboard presses for the actions. It works pretty well and was quite easy to use. The graphics still kept the dark black look of the previous games, and the music by Ken Arnold in the intro is fantastic, even though it's just the same theme from Ultima 5. I ended up playing the DOS version a few years later after that and was absolutely blown away by it. But that didn't taint my love of this humble version, the only 8-bit version ever made. And if you want to check out some more adventures in my RPG days, check out my top 10 C64 RPG video that you may enjoy. The game was praised in the press for its bold new look and interface, and the C64 version scored a whopping 98% overall in Zap64 magazine, with them saying, "Ultima 6 is simply incredible. There's even some superlative graphics, although for the most, the real appeal is in an enthralling plotline with untold depth, and the high level of character interaction with an intricately detailed and delicately balanced world that will take long time to explore. Ultima 6 is role-playing at its most creative. Witness the state of the art." There is unfortunately not, as far as I could find anyway, an enhanced version on the C64 for this, probably due to it being on 6 double-sided discs, so playing it will require oodles of patience. But for me anyway, it's the Ultima game that sticks with me the most, right up till this day.
And I really hope you had fun looking back at this classic RPG series. And you can also find those enhanced versions of the C64 games over at CSDB.DK. And thanks for joining me, Bastich B, at 64K. I hope you had a good time. And if you can please like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. I'll see you next time. Cheers.